I'm going to begin with a big picture. We economists are kind of like weather forecasters. We really don't know exactly what's going to happen in the future. And it's always best to tell people what the fundamental forces are and then let them make decisions based on that. So I'll give you the big picture, where the forces are, how we can compete against other countries. And then I'll speak specifically about all those countries that are listed there. It turns out that one of the reasons that there's so much uncertainty right now is that there's a huge disease problem in Asia. And you've seen evidence of that with the huge Korean imports last spring and then the huge Chinese imports this fall. It's really hard to understand, as an economist at least, and as somebody who's outside of those countries, it's hard for me to understand how severe those issues are and whether they can be eliminated or not. And if I could tell you the answer to that, I could tell you much more accurately about what will happen. But instead, I'll give you some data on the issue, and then hopefully you can make your own minds up. Also, one of the side things I do is we have some insurance products that are sold through the federal crop program called livestock gross margin. And as a result of that, I'm focused in on how risky the pig business is. One of the things I've noticed is that the variability, according to the futures and options markets, the expected variability of gross margins in this industry has gone up tremendously, and I'll show you some data on that. And part of it is because when you depend on export markets, sorry, Jeremy. Okay. When you depend on export markets, they can go away overnight, and I can show you visual evidence of that. So I think I'll give you good news at the beginning and then maybe a few gray hairs at the end. Okay, I think I've said this for 12 years and I've been pretty right. If you take a pig and you feed 3 pounds of feed and get a pound of live weight back, and then take that live animal, get 75% carcass back, take the 75% carcass and reduce it by another 25% to get boneless boxed product, you've essentially packed about 6 pounds of feed into 1 pound of pork. Now, it doesn't cost 6 times as much to move meat around as it does grain. It costs about 5 or 6 cents to get corn out of Iowa over to Japan and up to the mountain to the hog farmer. It costs about 12 to 15 cents to get the pork over there, and the pork goes right into the city, the port, and can be distributed very easily to people there. So the basic data always favors moving the lighter product. And that's important. And so, for instance, as you may have detected from my accent, I grew up in Europe. You do see grain movements when, let's say, when Denmark has more barley than it needs, it'll ship some of it on a truck into Germany. But you don't see the massive, large-scale grain movements among European countries, because when they want to move something, because there's complete free trade, they just move the finished product because it's cheaper to do so. Transportation economics are huge, as we know from the pipeline story that's going on right now. It's really important. Free markets will always find the cheapest way to move stuff around. And so when you do see big movements of grain, it's usually because somebody intervened with that process. And for years, Asia in particular, but also South America and other countries, have fixed the system so that they import the grain without a whole lot of barriers, but kind of keep the value-added products out. And so as those barriers are removed over time, you see more evidence of the basic economics, which is to move the finished product. There's no point just telling that as a theory. Here's some evidence. On the vertical scale is the percent of U.S. Broiler meat, turkey, veal, and swine that is exported. And so you can see that all of these industries, not just pork, are exporting more. Now, there can be shocks, such as what happened in the beef sector when we had BSE, and that's the gray hair story that's coming next. But generally, they move up. And this is another one. These are 4 countries with whom we have some sort of legal trade agreements. Not always perfect, but there. We have a free trade agreement with Australia and with Mexico. And they're both short of land useful for growing feed grains. Australia has plenty of land that's good for growing wheat for human consumption, but feed grains are a different story. And Japan and Korea, we have legally binding agreements too. And so when those went into effect, what happened is a bigger portion of the total pork in those countries is now imported. On the vertical axis is the percent of total pork consumed in a country that is imported. And there's a certain trend there, and that is as after the agreements, the economics began to work and they began to import more of their product. These are very controversial numbers in Korea in particular, and the official Korean statistics do not agree with the U.S. statistics because there's a fudge with carryout or something, but generally you can see there's a big trend towards importing more, with Japan importing about half of its pork and the other countries over about a 10-year period moving from 0 up to about 40% imports. There's one other reason that the final product moves and not the raw grain. People's tastes are truly different all over the world. The piece that I might like, a piece of a carcass that I might like, might be a little bit different than the part that you like, and so on. Now, I've spent a lot of time in the last 2 years in China. I've been there 3 times, one trip being quite long. And I got to actually enjoy the cuisine over there, which is very different than the Chinese food here. It's if you think of the carcass, start at the outsides, and they're the preferred pieces. The corners are the preferred pieces in most of Asia, whereas the U.S. you start at the middle and work the other way. The loin and the belly are favored, and then the ham and the the shoulder. So people's tastes are fundamentally different, and as a result, there's another reason to move the product around. If Asia were to produce all the head and tails and feet that it needs, then it'd have too many loins. So it's easier for them to just buy the pieces that they want from countries that have them available. This was a picture I took at a meal. Delicious food over there, but you do get very exotic items, and you got to open your mind and eat them. And that's a chicken bone-in with the chicken's head on top. And the person who was working with me on the trip, one might call him Amanda Larkin, a very rich, well-educated, French-speaking person. She reached out and grabbed that chicken head and popped it in her mouth. And the insight there is that, and I've checked this with the Chinese students I work with, or the Asian students I work with, they really do believe that those pieces are better than the other pieces. And as somebody who's had a chance to work with them and sample their diets, I kind of half agree with it. Fish head soup, to me, tastes better than fish soup. I don't know why. And many of you have tried bone-in ribeye instead of bone-out, and there's a certain distinct difference there. And so that also forces it, because what we could do, if markets were allowed to work, would be to move the pieces over there that are less in demand here, which would actually reduce the break-even price of producing loins and tenderloins for the U.S. consumer, which is something worth thinking about. Okay, now, you saw evidence of what happens with trade agreements. Real briefly, let me tell you what's going on. For years, the world tried to have more free trade by having multilateral agreements. And what happens in the end is 1 or 2 countries realize that they can get a good deal and they hold out, and then the agreements kind of get messed up. And last time, I think it was Brazil and India that really just held out for too long, and the agreement floundered. So we've moved to this other system where countries meet bilaterally and have established free trade agreements. And that's been working. And we, as many of you know, we now have a free trade agreement newly signed with Korea and Colombia, and I'll come back to Colombia and Korea, but ultimately it's 100 million rich people who now have access to the value-added products that are produced here rather than to only have access to the grains. And when those agreements are signed, there's a kind of a jumping on the wagon effect. In fact, the reason that we signed the agreement with Korea was Europe had signed one, and we wanted to be in that market. Well, Japan saw that Korea now had access to the U.S. market, so it wants to be part of a free trade agreement with the U.S. So there's a kind of rather than having one country block it up, when one agreement is signed, there's a contagious effect, and there's a lot of excitement right now with the potential to establish free trade with selected Asian countries, especially Japan, and that's a big opportunity, and I think there'll be many more. Okay, now moving on to competitiveness. One of the things I've learned in this business is I'll go to these countries and do this careful economic analysis of what it costs to produce a pig, and at the end of that work, I've got to take that number measured in yuan or pesos, and I've got to turn that into American dollars, just so that you all understand that it's dollar versus dollar. Well, the day I do that really influences what happens, because these currencies can move 5, 10, 20% in a year, and so things get haywire. And so you almost get frustrated because all the accuracy you put into the initial calculation gets lost because the currency's changed. And here's an example. These are John Lawrence at Iowa State, who I'm sure many of you have heard about, has a very careful data series on what it costs for an average Iowa farrow to finished producer. I think it's a little bit high. I think he keeps it high so that everyone thinks they're a little bit better than average, just like that. And that's the green line. And this was monthly data over 2009. And then Brazil has three similar series, one in Santa Catarina, one in Rio Grande do Sul. That's the bottom of Brazil, the traditional pork industry, and then Mato Grosso, which is the Wild West. And you can see those moving. They're the three colored lines that are moving up. Now, it's not that their expenses went up that year and ours did not. It's just that their currency got strong because Brazil is becoming a good place to invest. And so in that year, I just captured the moment when Brazilian costs actually increased beyond U.S. costs, having nothing to do with changes in productivity in Brazil, but only having to do with exchange rates. And since then, the U.S. the dollar has weakened relative to the Brazilian currency even more, so that if I did this today, the U.S. advantage would be greater than it is there. Now, ultimately, your competitiveness depends on productivity. And these are some charts that I've been making myself, and I'll explain what's going on now. Along the bottom, you got years, and it's about all the way from 1980, so it's a long history. And then on the vertical axis is tons of carcass produced per sow per year. So if you had 20 100 kilogram, let me do it in pounds, 20 200-pound carcasses, that would be 2 tons. And so nobody's at 2 tons yet, but you can see that everyone is moving up quickly. The line that starts out on the very top on the left and then ends up in second place on the right is Europe. They started out this period with a more efficient pig industry. But they wasted about 10 years, as you can see there. And it wasn't that their geneticists weren't working. It was just that they were integrating other countries into their system. They were learning how to deal with subtherapeutic antibiotics. They were learning how to keep their sows together with other sows and to keep their pigs longer with their mothers. And so they were doing other things, but in the race to have more production per year, they lost some time. Brazil's on the bottom. You can see it's surging. They're eliminating their backyard units, and they're developing very modern units. And then the U.S. is the one that starts in second place and ends up in first place. And in case you haven't noticed, although you probably know this better than anybody else, the U.S. sows are becoming phenomenally productive. Every year, you can have the same number of sows and get 3% more pork, and that's a big deal. That's, by the way, better than the grain industry. You know, you hear these fantastic stories about getting an extra 1.5% increase in corn yields. Well, sows are increasing twice that. So that's been a source of benefit. Now, part of that is because we eliminated some diseases here, and part of it is because the industry has been forced under incredible competitive pressures, and so only the good survived. But nevertheless, it stands to our benefit now. Some other data, it's not my own, it's from PIC. They compared, these are all South American countries, and then the U.S. is on the right. Now, PIC had a kind of a pig champion program, so they compared the best producers' cost of production in each of the South American countries against and then I added John Lawrence's average Iowa farrow to finish. And you can see that with the exception of Argentina, which for other reasons is not ever going to be a pork exporter, having to do with bad government. With the exception of Argentina, the U.S., even an average Iowa farrow to finish has lower costs and the best in South America. By the way, it's a small crowd, so I know you're tired. If you want to loosen things up, or if I didn't say something clearly, just raise your hand and I'll take questions as we go along. Now, what I do, and when I go on these trips, I go out to the country and talk to pig farmers and say, what's your cost of production? And that's what I have here. With the U.S., I've scaled it so that the U.S. is 1, and then the cost of production in these Asian countries is, if it's 2, it means the production costs are twice as much as the U.S. But I was careful how I put it, as reported by producer and producer groups, because sometimes I think that I only get shown the farms where it's kind of really good producers. Let's say somebody was wiped out with disease. Well, they're not going to welcome you in, and they don't have any pigs to talk about anyway because they're gone. So I think the Asian prices or cost of production are a little bit downwardly biased relative to the U.S., but it doesn't matter too much. You can see that most of them are at least 50% higher, with Malaysia and Vietnam and China almost twice as high. Why is that? Well, and this is going to be one of my punchlines, Asia in particular, but also in Colombia and even several other countries, is extremely land scarce. We all know that, but I was shocked when I went there and saw it. And what you've got here is a number of crop acres adjusted for multiple crops in some of these Asian countries relative to the U.S. And you can see that there's an enormous difference. And ultimately, people like me who believe in comparative advantage will argue that under free markets, the countries that have the land will export the products that use land intensively. And nothing uses land more intensively than corn and soybeans first, because you take a little bit of human labor and get a lot of corn and soybeans because the equipment is so good. And ultimately then feeding that into pigs and moving 5 or 6 pounds of grain in terms of 1 pound of pork. So the competitive forces here are for Asia to export labor intensive products such as fruit trees and garlic to the US, and then for the US to export land intensive products back to them. So again, there's a basic force. Okay, now, I used to discount Europe completely as a competitor. In fact, their exports of pork have been flat for several years. But things are changing over there. I could solve the Greek crisis overnight by having a Greek currency and having it go down by 50%. The Greeks wouldn't notice it, their wage wouldn't change, but suddenly from an international competition viewpoint, they would be exporting everything. And all we'd want to go there as tourists and buy their stuff. So one way to solve the Greek crisis is to devalue the currency, but they're not going to do that because it's linked up to the rest of Europe. So what the world economy seems to be doing is driving down the entire euro rather than just the 1 or 2 countries that are needed. And that's, I think, why the Germans had some trouble selling some of their financial instruments a couple of weeks ago. People just don't want the whole euro-denominated assets anymore, because I think we all understand that Europe as a whole has to become competitive so that the countries can grow and pay off their debt. And so long-term, I would be worried about a weaker euro. And if that happens, then they could emerge as a big source of competition. They have some of the best pork producers in the world. I would argue that the Danish pork industry has the best pork marketers in the world, phenomenally good. And they have a lot of land. There's a lot of land that can be grown expanded in Eastern Europe to grow winter and spring wheat, and that's just as good a pig feed as anything else. So this is the group of countries that I'd watch. Now, there's a big cost advantage in the U.S. because we have access to some of the drugs that they do not have, etc. I know it's Pfizer. Who makes what's that one that the feed additive? Sorry. Anyway, I won't be able to go on until I figure this out. Ractopamine. Who makes ractopamine? Pardon? Elanco. Okay. They're not the ones sponsoring the beer after. Okay. Well, I was going to. But anyway, the Europeans don't have access to simple things like that. So they do have some problems. But nevertheless, there is a level to which the euro could fall to where they will emerge as major new competitors. And we're not there yet. But when you go there, you see a lot of European bellies. And the European bellies are cheaper than U.S. bellies, and they're better prepared because they single rib rather than sheet rib the bellies, which is what they like. And there's an interesting story behind that. I grew up in Europe, and we thought only poor people ate what we call streaky bacon, which is the belly, and the rich people ate sliced the loin thin and made their breakfast bacon out of that. So they essentially don't have a use for the belly, so they export it. And also, when markets like the Philippines or China open up to variety meats, Europe is in those markets heavily too. But they're still about 20% over in terms of total costs. Okay, now I'm going to move on to some country-by-country numbers. And these are November trade data that came out a couple of days ago. These are U.S. exports of pork and pork variety meats to selected countries. I'm going to read out the countries on the bottom. The first with the biggest quantity is Hong Kong and China. Second is Mexico. Third is Japan. Fourth is Canada. fifth Korea, then Central and South America, Russia, Australia, the Philippines, Singapore, New Zealand, and a small little bit to Vietnam. I bet you're all surprised by that. You all think that the big market has always been Japan, and Mexico is big too. Most people are to see China emerge with such force. And I'm going to come, and that's the new game in town, and I'm going to spend quite a bit of time as to why that happened. But I got to emphasize, this is total meat, including variety meats. So I'm going to show you the same numbers now with the same sequence in value, and you'll see that China is not as important. Okay, now you'll see that in value terms in November, Japan was number one and China was only number two. But still, it's relatively important. Now, why do I include variety meats? I usually don't, but it's this thing, this Jack Sprat effect where you find a partner in the world that can eat the pieces you don't want. Well, they are the pieces that are called, sometimes called variety meats. So I think it's useful to include them because as the price of those goes up, the price of the carcass goes up too. And the price of variety meats has been going up because of a lot of this demand. Okay, so now I'm going to go through the countries one by one. I know you're going to get a little bit bored because it's a long list, and so I'll start with the exciting one, which is China, really Asia, because the issues in China are the same in Vietnam or in the Philippines or South Korea or Taiwan, and then I'll spend a lot less time on each of the other countries, because if you're in this crowd, it means you're interested in exports, which means you've already heard about Japan and Mexico. Yeah, sorry.
So, like that graph that you had, China, Mexico, and Japan, is there a possibility that any time one of those countries would say, stop, we're not going to do anything?
Yes. And that's the punch, that's coming next. At the end, I'm going to show you how exposed this industry is becoming to the loss of those markets. Now, how do I know that? Well, let's say you went to Chicago and tried to buy a put option on lean hogs. The person there should have, if they're doing the person who sells that option should do their homework and say, hey, there's a lot of downside price risk because we could lose all of these markets. And if we get foot and mouth disease, we would not only lose the export markets, the $6 billion export market for pork, but we lose the $6 billion export market for beef too. And so the U.S. consumer would find it hard to eat that much pork and beef, and you can imagine how low prices would have to be. Well, the person selling the option in Chicago knows that, and therefore they build that into the option price, and then I pull it back out and for the distributions I'm going to show you next. Okay. A little bit about China. This is the U.S. in blue, China's in red, amazingly similar size. So far it seems like they have plenty of agricultural resources, and yet I just said that they're scarce, and now I'll show you why. Pay attention to you see that bulge in the bottom right there? Pay attention to that because I'm going to focus on that. But also look at their northeast, which is about the same size as the U.S. northeast with about the same quality land. And the reason I want you to focus on that is that's where all the land is. That big mountain range in the west, there's nobody there. I flew over for what seemed like hours, and there's nothing out there, nothing at all. Now, there's a little valley in the mountains called Sichuan, and there's 100 million people in there. But other than that, everything is along that coast. With the addition of the northeast. This is where the people are. You see that, remember I said there's nothing out in west? Everybody's in that bulge I described, which is about the same size as the U.S. east of the Mississippi. And then you can see the other Asian countries, how densely populated they are as well, with Korea, Japan, Indonesia. I'm going to come back a little bit on Vietnam, but a very densely populated country too. And if I showed you the same map for the U.S., you would see that kind of population density between New York and Connecticut or somewhere, but otherwise, and between L.A. and San Diego, but otherwise the U.S. would not look as densely populated. Okay, so you go there, and now, where are the people in Asia? Well, they're on the good land. Why are they on the good land? Because the people who tried to live on the mountains are all dead because they starved. So there's a kind of a selection process that people all over the world tend to live where the land is good. The example I use in Iowa about my visit there would think of Ankeny and Des Moines, but you probably don't know that they're two cities that are already close together that are growing rapidly in a horizontal direction. Well, that's going on all over Asia. But in China, it's interesting because of the system there. They don't report how many acres are being lost at all to that kind of development. I know it's huge because I drove on a 4-lane once with 7 miles of new development on either side. But we just don't know how much because the local governments there make money by doing that, by developing and selling land to developers because nobody owns the land, so you can sell it to developers. But the central government doesn't want it to happen. So we don't quite know how much. The other thing that you see, this is some corn, but it could be any crop. The people who grow corn or soybeans on that kind of land have to be poor because you can only do about 3 acres by hand. You just run out of time at certain times of the year, especially at weeding time, because they don't have Roundup ready. And so, if you're only growing 3 acres of something, it shouldn't be corn because corn is land intensive. That is, it takes a little bit of labor in the U.S. and a lot of land to make corn. And so let's say you're getting $10 a bushel times 100 bushel. That's $1,000 an acre times 3,000. That's your total gross earnings for the year. And there's better jobs in cities. So people are starting to grow other crops on this kind of land or just put trees on there. And I saw a lot of trees being planted. Bottom line on China, they have this number, which is a red line of 120 million. They're not supposed to go below that, but they're well below that, but nobody knows how. My best guess is they have about 270 million acres, including multiple crops. The U.S. has about 360 million acres in crops. But if we included the kind of land that you just saw, we would have upwards of a billion acres. So that just gives you a sense of the density over there. They got almost 5 times the population on essentially 1/3 of the land. How do you do that? Well, you're very creative in how you use the land. You're very efficient. For instance, one thing you would never do is waste food. So at the backs of the restaurants, you see people collecting the food and refeeding it to the pigs. Very efficient, and you eat every part of the carcass. That's one way to do it. The other way to do it is not to eat so much protein and eat a lot of carbohydrates. But if you've tried feeding your own kids with just your own pigs with carbohydrate, you'll know that you don't get quite to the full capacity in terms of height here. And so that's a system that's going out of business. What's really happening is China and Asia in general are starting to import a lot of land. How do you import land? Well, you buy the products. And what's the most land-intensive product you can think about? It's soybeans. You only get 50 bushels, only a little bit more than a ton from a whole acre. I'm going to skip that. I'll come back to that, but this is just 2 products, cotton and soybeans, and this is China's imports, and I've translated it into acres. And we're almost at this year. China this year will import about the output of cotton and soybeans from 60 million acres. Is that a big number? Well, Iowa and Illinois together couldn't produce that much soybeans if we planted every acre and got the maximum yields. So they're buying from Argentina and Brazil as well. Another way to look at that 60 million is that the total impact on the world of the U.S. biofuels program, net of the DDGS, is only about 25 million acres. Now, this has already impacted you. Last spring, when the market needed a few more corn acres, soybeans rallied right back. They weren't coming out of soybeans. Well, where do you get them if you don't get them out of soybeans? You get them out of cotton. Well, guess who's buying a lot of cotton? So what do you do next? Well, don't make so much ethanol. Well, it turns out that China's importing about 20% of its sugar right now, so the world sugar sector is strong. So it wasn't going to come out of ethanol. In fact, Brazil sent their sugar to Asia and is buying our ethanol. So the market just needed a few acres, but the usual give isn't there because unbeknownst to many of us, a lot of it is being imported by a new customer. One other thing, this is a picture of how labor-intensive pigs are. I did, in my own life, raise pigs, and they actually have wrestle pigs just like that because we didn't have the handling facilities. So I know what's going on there, which is why I like the picture. But about half the production is still of livestock is still what are called backyard units. A lot of the grain in that is not really grain. It's collected from households or from factories or from the backs of restaurants. And it's an amazing way to save feed grains. Remember, feed grains are scarce because land is scarce. Well, feed them other stuff. But that's a business that it's tough because I don't know if I'm old enough to remember a person coming to my mother with 2 5-gallon pails on a bicycle, and then we'd give out the stale bread and the milk, and then that would be fed to hogs. That's a tough business to be in. It's hard to make money. And as soon as those people could afford motor scooters, they could take the scooter and get a job. So that industry disappears quickly. It's the official policy to get rid of it all over Asia right now. But here's the number. China produces 50 million tons of pork. We produce about 10 million. So they produce about 25 million tons of pork in this system right now. Well, what happens when that gets eliminated? Well, they have to buy commercial feed grain to replace it. And where's that going to come from? Well, it'll come from imports because, as I said, they're scarce. And then the issue is, well, will they buy the pork directly in pieces, or will they buy the grains? And why does that matter? Well, I think there are many pork producers in the audience. If you, right now, times are good because they're buying the pieces. But if they buy the grains, then times are bad because the price of corn and soybeans goes up. So there's a kind of a decision in the future that I don't know which way it will go, but it really impacts on everybody in the room. Either your production costs are going to go up because somebody's buying your feed grains away from you, or your output prices are going to go up because somebody's buying the pieces of the carcass that aren't as much in demand here. Yeah, two more on China. So I mentioned that they're buying a huge quantity right now. It's almost 1 million pigs a week or a month out of the U.S., but also from other countries. And the top line is very recent. It takes you through the end of 2011 all the way up to 2012. It looked like the high prices that they had in China, coupled with a lot of imports, was causing live hog prices to go down. But you can see in the last 2 or 3 weeks, it's popped back up again. And I'm wondering what's going on there. And it may be that the disease issues that I keep referring to are so bad that despite the increase in the number of sows that they've had and the increase in imports, that there aren't as many pigs out there as we thought, and that might explain why prices are going back up. And most of us thought that once prices started to come down, we'd lose that Chinese market. But there's some reason to expect that it would continue now. Well, one other thing about why variety meats are important. The orange line there is essentially the price of U.S. variety meats that we export. It went from 70 cents in December of 2010 up to $1.10, which is about a little bit more than a 50% increase. That's because we're exporting so much of that stuff. So there is a direct impact that I can show you. When they buy that stuff, the price goes up. Okay, I'm going to quickly hit a few other countries, and then I'm going to come back in a lot of detail to the disease issue because it's so important. Japan. The top line is Japanese pork consumption. It's flat. The red line is Japanese pork production. It's flat. And the blue line were exports. We had a lot of success there, but because production and consumption are flat, it hasn't been so good until last year when they had the earthquake. These are actual numbers from a couple of days ago. As a result of the earthquake, Japan imported 4.7% more pork last year. Now, we had a weak currency. We don't quite have a weak currency anymore because of the issues in Europe, but we did last year. So even though they only imported 4.6% more pork in Japan, they imported almost 9% more from us because we grabbed market share because of a low-value currency. You can see that directly. Look at the Canadians have had a strong currency because they have so much energy and commodities to export, and so their share went down a little bit because they lost share to us. But what else was special about this year? Well, we had high prices. So the value, the previous was in quantity, this is in value. The value of the pork we exported went up. The Japanese are rich, and so as our pork prices went up, they kept buying. And so even though we only exported 8% more pork, we doubled, we almost tripled the value of what we export to that country. Now, what's going to happen in the future? Well, you've got stagnant consumption. The earthquake is over. I wouldn't be looking to that country to be a major source of new exports unless we have this free trade agreement. They have barriers on U.S. pork. They're equivalent to about a 30 to 40% import duty. If we sign a free trade agreement with them, it would be an amazing development, especially if we do so and the Europeans and the Canadians do not. Europeans have a lot of inflexibility, so I don't think they'll sign an agreement with Japan. And the Canadians have supply control programs that may prohibit them from having a deal. So instead of splitting that market 3 ways, we could be in there with a standalone free trade agreement. Big time. Oh, yeah. TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership. We are in it. So are the Australians and the New Zealanders and the Chileans. And Japan saw that we have a free trade agreement with Korea, which means the Korean cars will have an advantage here. And so they are suddenly very interested in joining that. Canada has shown some interest in participating as well. Okay, Mexico. The yellow line on top is the consumption, the middle line is production, and the blue line is imports. It's been, except for this year when we had expensive pork, Mexico has just been buying more and more pork every year. And why? Well, we have a free trade agreement, which means those economic forces I mentioned at the beginning are in effect down there. There's as much reason for Mexico to buy corn and soybeans from us to produce pork as there is for Arizona to do that. Right? We don't ship corn and soybeans to Arizona to produce pork. We ship pork to Arizona. And so in the long run, you would expect that Mexico will continue to import more and more. In the long run, their own domestic industry will lose competitiveness as we get better at supplying exactly the products that market wants. Korea, fascinating country. As many of you know, somebody came back from Vietnam and brought a foot-and-mouth disease there, or potentially it came in from North Korea. But either way, they have what seems to be a perennial foot-and-mouth disease issue. They go in and wipe out those herds. They're supposed to wait 6 months and then say that the restrictions are lifted, but every now and then they get a subsequent outbreak. The green line is Korean consumption of pork. It's straight to the right because I'm projecting forward. That's what I do essentially for the industry, is project impacts. The blue line is their pork production. And that disease issue really hit them. That's that big drop-off. It hit them last year. It will continue to hit them this year because they're not repopulating. Now, if you're a Korean pork producer and you've just been wiped out and cleaned out, do you get back in business or not? Well, we don't know the answer, right? They've lost 30 to 40% of their industry. We don't know what will happen. But I do know that in 2012, they will not be allowed to put their manure in the ocean anymore. They will be forced to recycle it, and that's an additional burden. And so many of those farmers may or may not go back into production. They know that in 4 years, the U.S. has complete access to that market at our prices plus 15 cents a pound, and I doubt if many of them will rebuild. And so that's why my projection for Korean pork production goes down. They have the highest pork production costs in the world. The neighbors are a lot more cantankerous even than your neighbors, and a lot closer together. The disease issues I mentioned. So now have a look at that. That red line would be imports under that scenario, with the little broken off piece would be U.S. exports. A big year this year. We'll probably hit in 2011 when the numbers are out almost 200,000 tons. But we could double that with the agreement that we've already signed. A big development over there. Costco's there. Costco opened a store in Seoul. It turns out Seoul has a very many-layered middleman system. So instead of just, your local store buys from Tyson, they have 4 or 5 people who handle the product between that. So Costco went in and eliminated that. And that system was delaying the ability to sell chilled product in there. And so suddenly you've got a new system in place, which is the single most successful store that Costco owns in terms of selling meat is in Seoul, Korea, because they eliminated that system. And this is chilled U.S. Product, which we hadn't been successful at before, but are now. And that's going to revolutionize that sector too. Okay, Colombia. You never hear people talk about that, but we just signed a free trade agreement. It's a far richer country than I ever thought. It's a beautiful country to visit. My wife was afraid when I went to the drug cartel place, and it was a city as beautiful as San Francisco, so don't underestimate that. Their pork processor is a monopoly, so pork is very scarce there, but they're natural consumers of pork. They're essentially Spanish people who have the Spanish attitudes about pork, which are very positive. They just can't get pork. Very mountainous country, so not only does the U.S. product have to get to their port, but it has to go over 2 mountain ranges to get to their producers. And we're the only country with a good access to them because of our recently signed free trade agreement. The Canadians have a deal, but it's limited to 15,000 tons. The Cubans or the Chileans have a deal, but they have to pay this Andean tax. And so my projections are for 100,000 tons just to go straight into that country. 100,000 tons will be 1% of our production. So that's a big deal for a country that nobody even thinks about. A lot of it will be this product, which is delicious. It's called chicharrón, I think. Anyway, it's fried pork belly. I had it as an appetizer, but it filled me up. I was full for the entire day after eating this thing. This is me sacrificing myself for the greater good of the industry, because I wanted to see what this dish was, and it's an amazingly filling process, but it's delicious. So a lot of our skins will go there. Russia. They have a disease. They're obviously contiguously linked to the rest of Asia. It's called African swine fever. They have not been able to eliminate it. The Russians are not have not had to follow any of the laws that Japan and Korea followed, because they're not a part of any World Trade Organization, or at least they weren't. So they're a rich country with a lot of oil. They decided to build a pork industry, but their pork industry has been decimated by the problems with the classical swine fever. And as a result, they're getting to their claimed self-sufficiency much more slowly than they thought. When they came into the World Trade Organization a couple of weeks ago, the U.S. got them to make some adjustments to the quotas, so that now we have much better access. And so I would expect strong exports to Russia for several more years yet. But in the long run, they will achieve self-sufficiency just because they have the land. This is a little bit more detail on Russia than you probably need to know, but it explains what I just said. Last, I think, is Vietnam. Incredibly poor country, much far behind China, maybe 10, 15 years behind China. This was a woman who had a street stall. A lot of pork in Asia still sold in wet markets, and this was her whole product availability. Some blood, some lungs, and some internal organs. And she was going to make a living off selling that. And what I learned there is, remember, we have kind of bits going to China, and then maybe the skin might go to Colombia. That country loves bone soup. It's called pho soup. If we could find a way to get marrow over there, whoever can figure that out will get rich. I visited there, and instead of talking to me about economics and their industry, people were trying to buy pork from me because they're so scarce, bones and hocks. So we could sell the bones, the hocks, the lungs, and the blood, which are all heavy, and get very good prices if we got access to that market. It's another 100 million people, and economic growth is phenomenal, so that's going to happen too. But it'll be still way behind China. Okay. I mentioned disease several times. Here's the punchline. You remember where the people were in China? Well, look where the pigs are. That's because there was essentially these backyard units. The pigs have to be close to the people. But these are maybe 8 times more pigs than in the U.S., all crowded in essentially the East Coast. Guess where the chickens are? Same place. Now, they've got 5 times the population, and many of them are backyard, and many of them have pigs, and many of them have chickens, and many of those workers then go and work in the modern pig farms. But think about the number of times that you're touching a pig and touching a chicken, and then multiply that by billions. And then think of all the interactions essentially between the pigs and the chickens and those of the people. Those create opportunities for new diseases to form, and that's why we have a new flu just about every year. It comes out of all those interactions. One of the benefits of being Iowa State is that we seem to have produced a lot of the world's leading pig people, both in disease management and vet medicine and meat science. And so I was very well treated and probably was given some access to some information just because the people who were there had been at my university to do their PhDs. And one of them was the vet for the biggest pig producer in that country and in Asia. And he said that they have a disease called high fever PRRS, PRRS, which you're all familiar with, but this is a very difficult one to control. 100% mortality in nurseries and about 30% mortality in finishing barns. And that it was mutating so quickly that there was no point in having a vaccine. That it shared 87% of the DNA with the version that was around the previous year. How do you solve that? Now, you know that Iowa has a lot of sows, and this is a comparison with sows per acre in Iowa and China. You see how densely populated those sows are? Now add chickens to that mix, and then ask yourself, if you were building a new sow facility, how close to somebody with PRRS would you build it if you're worried about windblown disease? We have a county in Iowa called Sioux County where we're losing our sows just because people don't want to have, it's so densely populated with sows that people don't want to put any more sows in there. But we're far less densely populated than most of Asia in terms of disease. Okay, well, I should be able to prove that. Well, remember the slide I showed you earlier, which is the U.S. Productivity from each sow in terms of weight produced by each sow each year. Look at what's going on in Asia. There, Vietnam, Taiwan, Philippines, South Korea. There's none of those lines moving up. In fact, in general, the productivity of the sows over there is moving down. Now, because they buy our corn and soybeans, they're at what are called import parity, which means they're paying about 70 to 80% more for feed, for all of their feed, right? Once you're at import parity in Iowa, then you're at import parity in Minnesota. It doesn't matter if the feed is imported or not. The whole complex rises up to import parity. Now, it's hard to make money with $6 corn, feeding it to 2 sows that are productive. Imagine what it's like feeding $11 corn to sows that are half as productive. That's the issue they face. Of course, the government wants to be self-sufficient in pork. But to do so, it's got to buy expensive grain and waste it on unproductive sows. Last year, it said the solution was, get this, if your problem is sows that are too close together and you're a communist country, what's the solution? More sows. So they got more sows. And I think the disease problems are even worse, but we don't know for sure. Is that a knife edge? Yeah, question at the back?
Are the new units going up in the exact same areas, or are they more remote?
It doesn't, just, it's a map of China. There is, all the new units, they tried to put them in what is green on that, with one exception. They're building some facilities way out in the desert to the west of Beijing, and that's a new experiment that I just heard about 3 months ago. It happens to be the same company that gave me the information I provided with you. But that's a lot of infrastructure to build out west. And remember, you've got to get the grain into, let's say, Beijing, and then get it out there and put it in bags and put it on a truck and get it out there. So it's not a great idea, I think, but it's one of the solutions they're working on. So what do you do?
So there's infrastructure difficulties not only with hog building itself, but with transportation and so forth?
No, there are some bottlenecks with transportation, but they're building an amazingly good transportation system. In some ways better than we have here when they choose to do it right. It's phenomenally good. And I forgot to say that. This is not the Asia that you think. I mean, you get there, it feels like Manhattan. It doesn't feel like the picture some of us had in our mind. A very advanced country with very good roads. One thing that stuck in my mind, 2 stories, and then I'll stop. I drove on a freeway, and on both sides was an apartment building with the rebar still sticking out. The freeway had gone right through the apartment building, and people were living at both ends. And that's a form of capitalism that we don't have in the U.S. anymore. And the second, the official story in the communist paper was they were putting a road through, and the pig farmer wouldn't move, so they killed the 2 pig farmers with a bulldozer. I was thinking, why would the communist country tell other people that 2 farmers got killed because they were protecting their property? And then it hit me. They were warning people not to get in the way of those freeways. So this is the big issue. The government wants self-sufficiency, but they also want low food prices. In my opinion, as long as the disease problem persists, they can't have both. So they have to have high food prices or lose self-sufficiency. If they continue to add more sows, they make the problem worse. Right now, they're buying about the equivalent of 5 million tons of corn with all the pork that they're buying, but they don't want that to be the long run. And truthfully, I don't know how it's going to evolve. It depends on whether you can control those diseases with that kind of density or not. And actually, people in this audience know more about that than I do. So I'll leave that with a puzzle. If they buy the finished product, you get the kind of prices that the market is giving you right now, plus a little bit more. If they buy the raw material, your feed prices are going to be at least as high as they are now. And I don't know the answer. I know what the government wants, I know what it says it's going to do, but I know what the economics are too. Last couple of slides. This was back in 2005. It's, if you went into any classroom and said, what's the height of students? Well, you get a curve that looks like that, with some people being on the right are very tall and some people on the left being shorter. Well, this is our assessment using the option prices of the margin, the variability of the margin over all costs back in 2005. Back then, mid-range was about 68, and the worst possible case would the prices would fall to 45, 46, okay? So just a sense for how. Now, I'll show you what it looks like as of 2 weeks ago. Okay, the good news is, because of all these exports, now you're looking at a mid-range of in the 95 or so. But the downside is just as bad now as it was then. And given that everything is shifted to the right, it means that the variability of your gross margins has increased tremendously. Why? Two things. Well, you've got an ethanol mandate. Remember in 1995, 96, we ran out of corn. That makes feed prices more volatile if there's a scarcity of grain. And secondly, the market's already pricing in the small, tiny chance that we'll lose export markets because of disease. And all it would take is somebody to arrive in Las Vegas with a couple of sandwiches and decide not to eat them, and then they end up not being heat treated properly, and they end up being fed to pigs. Phenomenal downside risk right now, and something to watch out for. So the good news is, I think export markets are here to stay and will continue to grow. You know, there will be always a pig cycle, there will be always good times and bad, but in general, times will be a little bit better because of the exports. And the downside is we're exposing ourselves to enormous risk in the event that we lose one of those markets. And if you can do anything to make sure that we, let's say that people are honest when asked if they were in contact with animals, or maybe that anything to keep those diseases out, that would help. That would help tremendously, because otherwise it would be almost impossible to get American consumers to eat the kind of meat, beef and pork we export using prices alone.